since it's Aseret Teshuva, which is a time to reflect on being closer to Hashem, and reflect on Hashem's presence, so to speak, in our midst, in this world where all we see is world. I was thinking that would be appropriate to discuss something that kind of goes to the heart of the issue, that will help us to recognize, at least intellectually, Hashem's presence in the world as the Torah presents it, as the Torah sees it. And this brings us right back to the Parsha of the week. Parsha of the week begins, Ha'azino hashomayim v'adabeira, v'sishma ha'oretz imrefi. Moshe Rabbeinu is talking to the Shomayim, to the sky, to the heavens, and say, pay attention what I have to say. Then he turns to the earth and says, the earth should listen to what I have to say, should hear. Tishma. Would we say that this is just poetic liberty that he is taking and talking to the heaven, to the sky, talking to the earth? What's the meaning of that? I'm sure you learned Rashi. Rashi says that Moshe called these two major principal presences in the world to be witnesses. In our experience and in our orientation, in our view, the Shomayim do not know how to pay attention, and the earth does not know how to hear. Surely one could say that he's talking to the Ruchnius of the Shomayim, the Malach of the Shomayim, the Malach of the earth. But I would like to approach it, so to speak, head on. Because I feel that if we examine and we go into the depth of this concept, this would help us understand how the Torah views the world, and that it makes sense from a Torah perspective, from a mindset that is in concordance with the Torah, for Moshe Rabbeinu to speak to the earth and to speak to the Shamayim. We have a similar inyan, similar phenomenon, which we already discussed, which is on the archives when we talked about tefillah, about davening. And in davening, we say the Kapitel Tilim, that chapters of Tilim that we say in davening from Ashrei and Hallelujah, and there also David HaMelech is constantly enjoining the natural world, that they should praise Hashem. The stars should praise Hashem, the sun should praise Hashem, the moon should praise Hashem, all the animals on the earth. In our experience, we don't know what that means. And yet, this is part of davening, and this is something which we say in davening daily. And clearly, in davening, we do not play with poetic song. When in davening, we have to say that which we mean. We can't say in davening things that don't have any significance to us personally. That's what davening is about. So to enter into this so to speak, concealed box, to break through and to begin to have some kind of an insight, what is this talking about? I want to go back and elaborate a little more on what I've mentioned many times. The Rambam, in the very beginning of the Rambam, he says that the foundation of all wisdom, the foundation and the pillar of wisdom, which means the very beginning, before you begin to investigate, before you begin to study and try to understand, you have to know one big principle. And that is that there is a first being that creates everything. In other words, and as we discussed in the past, this is the foundation of wisdom, which means that this knowledge itself is not a second step. It's not after we already acquired wisdom and now we understand what it is. No, this we have before we even begin to study. This is the yisoid. Just like a building has a foundation which is under the ground, you don't see it. But everyone knows that what is the building standing on that foundation. And if you take the foundation out, the building would crumble, no matter how well it's constructed. So, in the way the Rambam expresses this principle, that there is a first being that makes everything, and the Rambam goes on and elaborates further, and he says that this knowledge of the first being that creates everything has to be in a person's mind with such clarity and such fundamental truth that if one would imagine for a moment that there isn't that first being, then he cannot imagine the existence of the world. In other words, this first being allows him to recognize that there is in fact a world. He knows that first being, in other words, before he knows the world, not the other way around. And he knows there is a world, and then he asks himself a question, where is this world coming from? And he gives an answer, there is a first being that makes it. That means that the world existed by him before he got the answer, who created it. But that's not the way the Rambam describes it. The Rambam says, if it does not perceive and recognize this first being, he cannot recognize at all that there is a world. Nothing can be. That's what the Rambam describes it. And I want to, this seems to be contrary to our experience, to our common experience. What I mean by common experience is the way we are challenged in the world, not the way we really believe deep down. What we believe deep down is exactly the way the Rambam describes it. But we have to get to it and we have to consciously connect to it. But superficially, that's not the way we think. Superficially, it seems to us that what challenges us? The world. And then comes the Rebishter. Then comes the Creator. So what does the Rambam mean by his description of this knowledge? What kind of knowledge is this? How can we possibly know from our own orientation? How can we know that there's a first being before we know there is a world? In our experience. If I say there is somebody who made this watch, first I have to see that there's a watch. If I didn't see a watch, would I imagine that there is a watchmaker? Certainly not. So if I don't see a world, where is the creator of the world? Where is the first being come in? How do I know about him if there isn't anything challenging me to know it? And yet, this is the way the Rambam seems to be presenting it. That in fact there is such a knowledge. And in fact this is the foundation, the basis of all wisdom. The basis of all wisdom is to recognize that the real presence in the world is not the world, but the creator of the world, the will of the world, of the creator. That's the real presence. So, to give us a little bit of a handle on this, with me? To give us a little bit of a handle on this, I want to mention again also something that we briefly discussed in the past, that the human being and his means to know, the seichel, the intellect that the human being has, this is a very important principle that we have to recognize, is unique in the entire existence. Meaning, even though there are animals that also seem to know and also seem to have smarts and are able to get around and catch their prey and build their nests and all kinds of natural instincts that they have that are able to do, that does not in any way put them anywhere close on par with the human being. It's very important that we understand this, because in today's world, again, there is a whole problem in the scientific world to clearly demarcate where is the animal world, where is the human world. And by the worldly definition of a human being is a smart animal, which means that essentially he is on par with an animal, but he's smarter than the other animals. But that's not the way the Torah presents a human being. The human being is not an animal. He is 100% human, not a smart animal. And what, in fact, is the difference, and how do we pinpoint that difference? To pinpoint this difference, we go back and see how the Torah describes the creation of the animals and the creation of the human being. The Torah says that on the sixth day, the animals were created. What? Adam was created in the afternoon. The first half, the animals were created. And it says over there, Hashem said, the earth should bring forth and living animals. Nefesh Chaya. And what this means, and as it discussed in Sforim, discussed in Chassidus, is that the animal, the nefesh, the soul, the life force that's in the animal, and its body were created together as a unit. At the same time. I'm sorry?
Could you repeat that?
The body of the animal and its soul that gives it life were created simultaneously, as one. The body came out alive from the earth. That's the way the Torah describes it. What this tells us is, and it clearly describes the animals as we know them, this tells us is that the soul of the animal it's a soul, it's a living thing. It has, so to speak, a spirituality to it. It's living, but its life quality consists only in the fact that it gives life and it quickens the body. It enlivens the body. That's the extent of its life. There is no independent life to it. Independent from a body. It is a life that lives at the level of the body. Whatever is significant to the body of the animal, this is what's significant to the soul of the animal. Let us put it in simple terms before I'm going into great elaboration, but this is obvious. A human being eats in order to live, and then in order to do something else, whatever it is. I eat in order to learn and daven. Lahavdul Hagoy in order to enjoy other things. But eating is not an end in itself. Eating is a means to survival. And then there is other things that he wants to enjoy. He wants to become known. He wants to be a big businessman. He wants to be a president of the United States. He wants to accomplish something. The animal eating and its living is one and the same thing. If you watch, an animal, if there is food in front of it, it will eat. This is a constant, a continuous activity. So that the soul of the animal has cognizance, has intelligence only to the level of what the body can relate to, what's significant to the body, and that's all. That's the limit of its soul. The human being was created in an entirely different order and different manner. As I mentioned before, it is extremely important that we understand this and reflect on this. The human being was created in a manner where the body was first formed out of earth, all from Yadam, and it was a lifeless body, having the form, whatever the form was, the human form, that God formed from the earth. And then, as it says in the Torah, Vayipach b'yapav nishmas chai, and then God blew into his nostrils. We will never understand the secrets of creation, but the way the Torah describes it, for the purposes that we should understand what it is, the human being, what is a human being. That he blew into his nostrils a soul of life, and then man became a living being. Which means that his life, his soul, and his body are two separate, independent entities. the soul does give life to the body. But that is not the limit of the soul. That is not what the soul is about. The soul is an independent entity. As such, as an independent entity, it also gives life, it also connects to the body and gives life to the body. But it's not part of the body. And it's not limited to the needs and to the functions of the body. There's an expression today, there's a common expression in the world. One to describe a person who can think independently, it's called thinking out of the box. Do you ever hear the expression, thinking out of the box? What is meant to describe there is that person is able to think not through the process, only through a logical process, that one thing brought him to the next step, so that it's exclusively a procedural type of thinking, but he can think something beyond the procedure. He can think of an idea independent of any of his experiences. It's called thinking out of the box. That's even existent in the world as an expression. He can come up with an idea that is completely disconnected to any previous experiences. Why is he able to do this? Because in fact his soul is not part of the body. The human soul is a totally independent entity that consists of the intellect and the emotion. And the intellect, the human intellect, is such that scratch that, I want to go back a little bit. This will allow us to understand the difference between the intellect of the human being and the intellect, quote unquote, of the animal. We said before, the animal also seems to have mind powers. But as I said, they're categorically separate, completely. And what is the difference, if we want to pin it down? The animal can only understand distinctions and forms that exist in the world, exist outside of it. The animal can find its way among trees, it can find its way among furniture pieces. So it can distinguish the things that exist. But the thing themselves that exist there independent of its mind. It's not that it conceptualizes. The animal cannot conceptualize. The animal can only see what it is and see whether this is something which is safe or dangerous. Can I get through here or I cannot get through here? Is this edible or it's not edible? But the object itself is something that exists on its own, independent of its identifying it, of its knowing it. The human being has a completely different mind power. Even on the lowest level of the human mind, what's called the human mind, Seichel Anushi, he can identify a presence that does not exist empirically. What empirically means physically. It exists only because of his human mind. That's why it exists. It is the human being that gives it existence. And if not for that, it wouldn't exist. It doesn't exist. We spoke about this many times, but it's warned to repeat itself, to be repeated until it dawns on us, until we begin to really relate to it. I illustrate it always with the following situation. If a person comes into a feast, a bar mitzvah, chasana, any kind of a celebration, And the celebration invariably will be celebrated by means of a meal. And if it's a meal, there are tables and chairs, and there are place settings, and there are flowers, and there is food, and there are people. And if a human being enters one of these halls, what does he see? If he is going to report and say, oh, I was just in this place, and there was what? There were tables and chairs? No. He will say, there is a celebration. There's a bar mitzvah. There is something going on that does not have an empirical presence. It's only an idea. Whereas if an animal enters one of these halls, what does the animal see? There are tables and chairs and food. That's what the animal sees. Does the animal have a concept? Can you possibly imagine an animal understand? No, there's something more going on but the food and the tables? Can you imagine an animal of having that type of intelligence at this low minimal level? Absolutely not. No such thing. The human being is capable of seeing that which doesn't exist physically, so to speak. And he is the one who defines what there is.
The human being does?
Excuse me?
The human being defines what it is?
Yeah. Because he's a human being. That's why he can identify that. That's why the whole concept of a celebration exists. This is, I said, on the minimal, on the lowest level. And if a human being comes back and says, I was in a place and there were tables and chairs and food, you would think that he is nebuch, an idiot. He is lacking basic human intelligence. Why was it there? Who cares? It was food. That's not human. The human being immediately recognizes not what there is there physically, but why it's there. What is its intellectual value? What is its human value, human presence? Because he recognizes that if not for the intellectual value, if not for the human presence, it wouldn't be. Even though this intellectual value is an intangible, whereas the tables and chairs and the food are very much tangible. And yet, what does he notice as a human being? He notices that intangible. And that's the real thing that happens. That's the real thing that happens. That's the real thing that he participates in. He does not participate in a meal. He participates in the celebration. And the power to recognize this is present in a human being because how can he relate to something that is intangible and that should be the reality? It is in fact because his soul, his neshama, is an independent presence from the body. He comes in, he doesn't have to feel and touch everything in order to know that it's there. He doesn't have to identify it by name and by value and by weight and by color to know what it stands for. He identifies things by his intellect. Why it's there and what is really behind it, what is the real presence that makes it be. That's what intellect is all about. What makes this be? That's the real presence, not what it is physically. And this is where the human being differs from the animal categorically. There isn't anything similar in the animal world at all. It's unimaginable that it should happen. Thus, this brings us to the next step. As we said, the human intellect notices and relates not to the tangible and to that which is presented to him, but rather to the reason and the real background why this is present. What makes it real? This is what he relates to. And if there isn't any real reason why this exists, then to the human being it does not exist. He can relate to it. He can celebrate only if there is a celebration. If not, the whole thing and the tables and chairs and the food doesn't entice him at all. It doesn't exist. The similar view, the similar experience at a much higher and more significant level is in how we see the heavens and the earth and the whole of existence. We see a whole world, a very elaborate, wholesome existence. And what we actually observe, so to speak, on par with the animal, is its physical presence. There's the sun, there's the moon, there's the trees and their houses, there's earth, all kinds of disparate means unconnected, insignificant entities. But then comes the human intellect. Because the human intellect comes from his soul. And his soul says, no, that's not real. It doesn't have any reality to it. You have to relate to the reality. Meaning, what makes it be? What does it stand for? What does it represent? Why is it there? What makes it there? What does it stand for? What is its aim? What is its purpose? Without that, what are you relating to? What are you seeing? And this is where it becomes much more realistic and much closer to the surface, to a person's mind, that yes, indeed, there is a world, a physical world, but what is the physical world stand for? It actually represents the Creator. It actually represents a plan, a purpose. It does not represent, it does not stand for nothing. And more elaborate and more complicated and beautiful the world becomes in his eyes, the more he recognizes that it has to be, it's representing something of a real significance. So that this is in fact, in very brief terms, the way the Medrash describes the search that Avraham Avinu went through. Avraham Avinu had the highest level of intellect, but he grew up in idol worshipping society without any exception. In other words, he had no recourse. There was no breakaway society that said, no, we don't believe it. This was the whole society, idol worship. And they developed all kinds of fears that if you deviate from that, this is going to happen. You deviate that, this is going to happen. All kinds of different structures. To the point that when Avraham Avinu he destroyed his father's idols, his father went and consented of having him thrown into fire. Because this was a dangerous thing to do. This was going against everything that he believed. What was Avraham Avinu's power? What did he see? What did he recognize? He recognized, as it says, basically one simple principle. It's impossible that there should be such an elaborate structure without anything behind it, without any meaning. And I'm looking for the architect. And I'm looking not only for the architect, because the architect actually works under the direction of the owner who gives him the order. I'm looking for the owner. What is it about? Why did he build it? This was a principle. Why did Avraham Avinu get this principle? He got it straight from his soul. Because this is, in fact, inherent in the human soul. Except, of course, Avraham Avinu's soul vision was much more powerful and much clearer and higher and so forth. But in any case, all of us, especially descendants of Avraham Avinu, have that in our souls. We have that capacity to see the world from the perspective where the Rambam describes it. That first there is a first being, and then there is a world. And if not for the first being, we cannot imagine that there is a world. Because how can we relate to a world that has no significance, that's going no place? Our intellect would not allow it. We can relate to it. As a matter of fact, this has been amply demonstrated in recent history, where young people were told that the whole purpose of life is to enjoy life, and they said that's not life at all. And they went and they destroyed every tenet of social practice. Young people who grew up in opulence, in homes, in wealth, comfort, threw everything away. I don't want wealth and comfort. I want something meaningful in life. And you presented to me a dark world that goes no place and means nothing. That does not allow me to relate to it. It has to be something that I can relate to. At the minimum, at least on the human level of intellect. Then there is a higher level human, there is a nefesh halakis, a godly soul, and so forth, but at the minimal level. So, when we really reflect deep down what it is that we observe in the world itself, when we are when we are observing the world from our intellectual perception, rather than from our physical experience. Then we will see that the reason we can recognize and we can relate to world is only because we recognize that there is a source and there's a background, there's a soul to the world, there's a meaning and a purpose, there's a creator. And the whole world really does not stand for its physical weight and physical size. It stands for its spiritual message, spiritual purpose and meaning. And thus it becomes quite acceptable and not far from our, so to speak, from our orientation to say, yes, you can speak to the earth, because the earth is not an inanimate, a senseless, meaningless blob of existence. The earth stands for something. It stands for something godly. And not only it stands for something, it represents God's will. And in that respect, the earth is very sensitive to what you say, what you do. In the Hayom Yom, you read Hayom Yom every day over here after davening, I presume. So I don't know if all of you heard this, but in one of the Hayom Yoms, I don't remember which one, the Rebbe says over there that the time will come when this will be revealed, but even now, before it's revealed, when a person walks on the ground and he is preoccupied with insignificant thoughts, or even with forbidden thoughts, forbidden talk, forbidden activities, certainly, and even if it is not forbidden, even if it is neutral, but it's nothing to do with Torah and Kedusha, the earth under him complains and says, Bulach means boor, idiot. What gives you the right to trod upon me? How are you above me? How are you superior to me? You are given the right to trod upon me because you're a human being. You have a soul. But where is your soul? You are a body. You're involved in bodily thought. How are you any superior to me? What gives you the right to treat upon me? That's what it says in one of the Hayom Yoms. The Torah has established the superiority, so to speak, the incomparable superiority, the categorical superiority of the human being versus the animal, to the point where the Torah permits a human being to take an animal, kill it, and eat it. And we don't consider this to be brutal, to be inappropriate. How can you take a living thing and kill it and eat it? Why? What is the justification? How do we relate to it? A human being is not the body that you're looking at. This is the human soul. That's what the human being is. The animal is also not the body that you're looking at. It is the purpose for which it was created that really gives it its presence. And thus, the animal actually, in terms of its godly purpose, finds its completion and its perfection and its elevation by being incorporated in a human being and by giving the human being the ability to do his higher things, his higher biddings, his higher purposes. There's obviously much to elaborate and talk about this. I want to bring it back to what we started in the Indian, that we can relate to the principle that you can speak to the heaven and you can speak to the earth. Moshe Rabbeinu at least can speak to the heavens and the earth because he actually saw the heavens and the earth from the true perspective, not the way they're presented to us, so to speak, from a insensitive, blind view, but from what they truly stand for. And thus, by reflecting on this, we can more readily relate to the godly presence in the world. At least we can recognize, whether we can fully relate to it and fully experience it intellectually, but we can readily understand that the fact that we don't see it is because we haven't developed yet, or we are short in bringing out our true intellect. But in truth, we also, each one of us has a soul that is ruchni, that is spiritual, completely higher, independent of the body. And the soul really is capable of seeing and relating to the world and to relating to all existence, not from an existence in a worldly perspective, but from a godly perspective. Like the Rambam is saying, the soul can first and foremost recognizes what's truth. And the only truth there is Hashem, is God. That's the only real true presence, real true existence. And that's what the soul relates to. And everything else emanates from this truth. This brings us back to the union of the Aseret Teshuva and Shabbos Teshuva and Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, Eden stand at the highest point and the highest level that a Yid experiences throughout the year. He's completely pure. And what is his purity consist in? That he is, at that moment, recognizing this principle, that actually his soul is superior to the physical world. That's why he doesn't eat. There's an independence. He actually recognizes the godly presence on a true level. And like the Rebbe always says, that the Pasha of the week illustrates, is related to the period of the week of when it is being read. When they say Hashomayim, Hasina Hashomayim, the Sishma Ha'oretz, the Moshe Rabbeinu makes this statement, which clearly state to us that Shomayim Ba'oretz are not what they appear to be, a meaningless presence, but it's a living presence that has a godly meaning, a godly life in it. That brings God much closer to us, which is what we need in these days. The days of Teshuva, because that's what Teshuva means. Teshuva means to return back and to come closer to God. And to rise out of the confines of the physical world, which confines us in the sense that it kind of denies anything behind its existence. That's what the physical world is. And we, with our intellect and with our soul, defy it, and we say, no, that's not true. And eventually, Hashem's help, soon, this whole truth will come to complete focus and complete revelation. as a result of all the good work that each one of us does now with Kabbalah soil and breaking through our own barriers, breaking through our own darkness, so to speak, our own connection and our own imprisonment in the physical world. We ultimately have accomplished the breaking all the general barriers of the physical world, so that the physical world now becomes actually a source of recognizing a godly presence. And each one of us here, Hashem should help each one of us here, should really, so to speak, get into proper introspection and recognize the truth as we see it, and have real tshuva. I don't mean tshuva from Avedas, I mean tshuva in terms as you learn, in terms of elevation, in terms of really recognition of real life or real meaning in life. And this will bring us to Sukkot, to Simcha, and we should have a successful and joyous year together with Mashiach. Question?
Yeah.
Sure.
I agree about the animal and like the human being, but isn't like what like how we we see tables and chairs and food, like isn't what we see in that, it's by association, like we associate those things with something that we've already experienced in our life.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Right. No, it's not.
It's not.
I'll tell you why. I mean, clearly it is, as you say. I mean, how do I come to a conclusion?
Yeah.
Because I've seen it before.
Yeah.
Right. But if I hadn't seen it before, what would be my first question?
It looks like there's something important going on.
Something going on, right?
Something going
How
on.
do you know that? Why doesn't the cat ask the same thing? Hey, what's going on?
Yeah.
Nothing's going on as far as the cat is concerned. But something is going on as far as you're concerned, even without any prior experience. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's what I'm talking about. The fact that you're able to figure it out, that does not mean that the only reason you know that something is going on is because of previous experience.
Yeah.
Not at all.
Okay.
And this is why, without any prior experience, when you look at our beautiful world, we know that something is going on.
Yeah. So what's the like godly, like when he spoke to the heavens and the earth, like what did they represent in that sense, like heavens and the earth? Everything?
That the very existence of the world attests, are the witnesses,
Yeah.
and that maintain this testimony that God has given us this, made with us this covenant, and that, God forbid, if we fail, we are going to be brought back in all kinds of different ways. But the ultimate covenant is that we will come back. And the very existence of the world exists because of that covenant, and they are witnesses. That's what the world stands for. Okay. Okay, I'm going to shut this off.